The greatest empire the world had ever seen stretched across 127 provinces. Its palaces had columns of marble, curtains of linen and silver, and floors of multicolored mosaic. And in some quiet corner of that vastness, a young Jewish orphan woke up every day with no idea that those halls would one day be hers, Susa, capital of the Persian Empire. A city built upon an artificial hill in what is today southwestern Iran, nearly 200 meters above the level of the valley that surrounded it. To reach it, you crossed rivers of dark waters, plains interrupted by ridges of white stone, and dirt roads that dried in the sun and turned to mud in winter. It was a journey of weeks from any significant point in the ancient world. And when you finally spotted the city on the horizon, the first thing you saw was not a wall. It was the palace, because the palace of Susa was built to be seen above all else, a symbol of power that needed no words to communicate its message. Ahasuerus, the same man secular history records as Xerxes I, son of Darius the Great, ruler of the largest territorial state humanity had ever created up to that moment, commanded from Susa with an authority unparalleled in the ancient world. His dominion stretched from India to Ethiopia. The first chapter of the book of Esther records this reach with the precision of a state document, 127 provinces. Consider that magnitude for a moment. 127 distinct regions with distinct languages, distinct gods, distinct legal systems, all answering to a single man seated on a golden throne in Susa. Egypt was one of them. Babylon was another. The devastated Judea, that land of barren hills that had once been the heart of a people before being reduced to ashes and silence, was also on the list. And it was precisely in this context that a young woman named Esther existed, not as a queen, not as a figure of any political importance, as one among millions of anonymous subjects in an empire too vast and too preoccupied with its own greatness to notice someone like her. To understand Esther's life before the palace, you need to understand why she was in Susa. And to understand that, you need to go back decades before her birth, to a tragedy that shaped the destiny of an entire people and that still echoed in the city's streets when she was a child. The story begins in the year 605 before Christ. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon invaded Jerusalem for the first time and took hostages, young men from the Jewish nobility, from the intellectual elite, people whose talent and social standing would be useful to the new dominant power. It was a strategy of domination that the great empires had refined over centuries. You did not need to destroy a civilization to control it. You needed to remove its best human resources and incorporate them into your own system. A few years later, Nebuchadnezzar returned. This time, the plundering was far more extensive. King Jehoiakim of Judah, also called Jeconiah in biblical records, was captured. Treasures from the temple were removed. 10,000 people were deported in a single operation: soldiers, craftsmen, priests, community leaders. The second chapter of the book of Esther specifically mentions that Mordecai had been taken from Jerusalem among the exiles deported with Jeconiah. This means that Mordecai's family was among those 10,000. It was not a choice. There was no choice to be made when the Babylonian army arrived at the gates. And then came the definitive end. In 586 before Christ, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem completely. The temple was burned, the walls fell, the city was turned to smoldering ruins. Judah had ceased to exist as a sovereign nation. Babylon fell to the Persians in 539 before Christ. King Cyrus issued a decree allowing exiled peoples to return to their homelands. Many Jews returned, but many did not. Entire generations had been born in exile. Their children had been born there. Their dead were buried there. When the Persians took control and Susa became the new capital of the dominant power, The Jews who had settled in the region simply remained where they were, now living under Persian rule instead of Babylonian. Mordecai's family was one of them. The second chapter of Esther introduces Mordecai with genealogical precision uncommon in biblical narrative text. Son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin. 4 generations recorded in a single verse, and that detail is not there by coincidence. The name Kish appears in another decisive place in the Hebrew Scriptures. It was the name of the father of King Saul, the first king of Israel, also from the tribe of Benjamin. The genealogical connection remains a subject of debate among scholars, but the text seems to establish an intentional link with an older story that was still being resolved. Saul had spared King Agag, the Amalekite, when God had ordered complete destruction. That disobedience brought consequences that rippled across generations, and centuries later, a descendant of Benjamin named Mordecai would face a descendant of Agag named Haman. History was about to fold back upon itself in ways no one in Susa at that moment could have foreseen. But before any confrontation with Haman, before any palace intrigue, there was a child without a father and without a mother, navigating alone through a world that had not been built for people like her. The text of Esther chapter 2, verse 7 says without preamble, "And he had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother." There is no date, no recorded cause, no described circumstance, only the bare and direct statement: Esther's parents had died. Mordecai, her father's cousin, had taken her as his own daughter. She had 2 names. Hadassah in Hebrew means myrtle, the plant with dark leaves and white flowers associated in Jewish tradition with peace, purity, and the renewal that came after exile. The prophet Isaiah had used the image of the myrtle to speak of the restoration of Israel. It was a name of hope. And Esther, most likely derived from the Persian stara, meaning star, or perhaps connected to the name of the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, who had been worshipped in the same lands where her ancestors lived in exile. The biblical text preserves both names without explaining the origin of the second. What is known is that outside the Jewish circle, she was Esther. To Mordecai and her own people, she was Hadassah. 2 names, 2 worlds, a life lived between borders that most people never needed to cross. What does it mean to be a Jewish orphan in Susa in the 5th century before Christ? You have no full citizenship. You are a member of a conquered people, living in the capital of the people who conquered them, following laws you did not create, in streets that speak a language that is not that of your deepest heritage. Your mother tongue is Hebrew, preserved at home, in songs, in prayers repeated before sleep. But the language of the streets, the markets, the administrative gates was Aramaic and Persian. Your collective history is that of a people who lost their land, their temple, their political autonomy. And you are a child, without parents, dependent on a man who, for reasons the text does not explain in detail, chose not to abandon you when he could have done otherwise. Mordecai worked at the king's gates. Several passages in the book of Esther mention him present at the gates of the royal palace. Those gates were not merely architectural entrances, they were centers of administrative and commercial life, where contracts were made, legal disputes were heard, and news and rumors circulated from the interior of the palace to the city and back. To be at the gates meant having some position within the structure of power, some degree of access, some recognized usefulness. Mordecai was not a beggar surviving on the margins. He was someone inserted, even if peripherally, into the bureaucratic structure of the world's greatest state. But there was something he protected with care. His Jewish identity was not necessarily hidden. The text calls him Mordecai the Jew at several points. What he protected was Esther's identity. From the beginning, he had instructed her not to reveal her people or her family. The text offers no explicit explanation. Perhaps it was instinctive protection, cultivated across generations of exile, where ethnic visibility at certain moments created deadly vulnerability. Perhaps Mordecai, observing the political currents from the king's gates, sensed tensions that had not yet erupted but could. Whatever the reason, Esther grew up learning to inhabit two worlds at the same time: Jewish identity inside the home, in customs, in memories, and a public face, Persian, adapted, functional in Susa. She had learned from a very young age that there are things one keeps not out of shame, but out of wisdom. And then came the third year of Ahasuerus' reign. The king gathered all the elite of his power: princes, servants, military commanders of Persia and Media, nobles and governors of the provinces. Esther chapter 1, verses 3 and 4 describes what happened next as a systematic and calculated display of opulence that lasted 180 days. 6 months. Ahasuerus displayed the glorious riches of his kingdom and the magnificent splendor of his greatness. For 6 consecutive months, every detail of that event was a political message with specific recipients. Look at what this man can sustain. Look at what this state can do. None of your nations, with all their history and resources, come close to this. After the 180 days with the empire's elite, Ahasuerus gave a second banquet for the people of Susa, from the greatest to the least. It lasted 7 days. It was held in the garden court of the palace. And the text of Esther, chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, describes that space with a richness of sensory detail rarely found in biblical prose. White and blue curtains, fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rings on marble columns. Couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and colored stones. Golden vessels, each different from the other, for serving the royal wine. And there was a specific stipulation: no one would be compelled to drink more than they wished. Somewhere in that city, while banquets followed one another and the royal wine flowed, Esther lived her life as a young exiled Jewish woman, without access to any of it, without reason to imagine that that garden with its golden couches had any relevance to the course of her existence. And then the 7th day of the banquet arrived. Ahasuerus was merry with wine, and he commanded his 7 eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti before him, with the royal crown, so that the peoples and the princes could see her beauty. Queen Vashti refused. The construction of the Hebrew text is remarkably economical. No dialogue, no explanation given by the queen, no intermediary attempting to negotiate. Only the fact she refused to come, and the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Place in political perspective what that refusal represented. A king who had spent 6 months meticulously building the image of his power before the leaders of the ancient world, who had spent 7 days demonstrating generosity to the people of his own capital, had been publicly disobeyed by his own wife. Not in private, where the incident could be absorbed and ignored, before everyone. A queen who said no to a king accustomed to not hearing no. The wise men and experts in the law were summoned. The argument they presented was simultaneously legal and political. If the queen has done this, the disrespect will spread throughout the empire, from great to small, from noble to commoner. The disobedience of one woman in one palace could unravel the order of an entire empire. The decision was announced as a formal decree. Vashti would no longer come before King Ahasuerus, and her position would be given to another who was better than she. Letters were sent in every language of every people to all the provinces. The decree went out. The matter was closed in the logic of palace protocol. But empires have long memories for what shames them. After the anger of Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, the decree that had been issued. And it is precisely at that moment, a powerful king sitting with the weight of what could not be undone, that the mechanism that would bring Esther to the throne began to turn, slow and relentless, like machinery that does not know it is changing the history of someone who had not yet even been noticed. What does a king do when the only decree that cannot be reversed was issued by himself? Ahasuerus had lost Vashti to an act of protocol that he himself had transformed into permanent law. The solution could not come from within. It had to come from outside. His servants proposed the way out that made sense in an empire organized by calculation and efficiency. Let beautiful young virgins be sought throughout all the provinces of the kingdom. Let commissioners be appointed in every city to bring them to the royal harem in Susa, under the care of Hegai, the eunuch in charge of the women. Let them receive their portions of cosmetics and preparations, and let the young woman who pleases the king take the position of queen in place of Vashti. An imperial decree went out, and Susa would never be the same for a young woman named Esther. Pause for a moment and consider what that decree meant for families throughout all the provinces of the empire. It was not an invitation subject to acceptance or refusal. It was an order with the full force of a state mechanism behind it. When the king's commissioners came to take your daughter, you did not argue, you did not negotiate. You had no legal recourse to protest. The text records no farewells or family debates. It records only the objective workings of a system. The decree went out, the young women were gathered, the process began. Esther was one of them. The text of Esther chapter 2 verse 8 uses a specific word. She was taken to the king's palace, under the care of Hegai. Taken. She did not come. She did not choose to come. She did not ask to participate. She was taken. It is a small distinction, but it weighs enormously when you gauge what was happening. A young orphan who had learned to exist on the margins of two worlds was removed from the only environment she had ever known and placed inside the walls of the most powerful place in the ancient world. Enter now one of the most dramatic transitions of Esther's life. She had grown up in a modest home with a cousin who loved her as a daughter and who worked at the king's gates to provide for her, in a city of exiles who preserved their customs in hushed voices. From one moment to the next, she found herself inside the most opulent palace in the ancient world, surrounded by hundreds of young women brought from all the provinces of the kingdom, all brought by the same decree, all subjected to the same process. Hegai was the eunuch in charge of the harem. The text says that Esther pleased him and obtained his favor immediately. That sentence carries a weight that goes beyond its surface. Hegai was not a minor official. He was the man who knew the king's tastes and patterns with a depth that no minister or general could ever have had. He had spent years observing Ahasuerus in private situations that no other human being witnessed. He knew what pleased, what bored, what went unnoticed, what stayed. And among hundreds of young women from every corner of the greatest empire in the world, he saw something in Esther that made him act immediately. Hegai promptly gave her her portions of cosmetics and food. He assigned her 7 chosen maids from the palace itself, and he moved her to the best place in the harem. 7 maids, the best place, promptly. How could someone who had lost everything in childhood awaken this kind of immediate recognition inside the walls of the most guarded palace in the world? It did not take weeks of comparative assessment. It was not a decision that ripened after prolonged observation. It was immediate. And that says something about Esther that the text never attempts to name with abstract terms. There was something in her that leapt to the eye even of one who had seen everything an imperial harem could offer. The preparation process lasted 12 complete months, an entire year before even coming into the king's presence. A year of a routine imposed with precision, of a life completely reorganized around a single future moment that might or might not unfold the way each young woman hoped. The first 6 months were devoted to oil of myrrh. Myrrh, an aromatic resin extracted from the commiphora tree native to northeastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, had uses that went far beyond perfume. It was used in Egyptian embalming, in religious rituals throughout the Mediterranean region, in medicinal practices as an anesthetic and anti-inflammatory. Its extraction involved cutting the bark of the tree and letting the sap harden in the air, forming golden tears traded at prices beyond the reach of any ordinary family. 6 months of immersion in that oil was a luxury of proportions incomprehensible to anyone living outside the walls of an imperial palace. The following 6 months were devoted to other perfumes and cosmetics. Persian historical sources from the period record an extraordinary variety of aromatic substances in use at the court of Ahasuerus. Sandalwood unguents from India, plant extracts from the trade routes of the East, resins transported in caravans from Arabia, oils processed in specialized centers that supplied the elite of the ancient world. The entire luxury industry of an era converging toward a single preparatory purpose. And there was one rule that the text mentions with clarity. When it came time for each young woman to go to the king, she took with her only what Haggai, the guardian of the women, determined. Nothing extra, no personal additions. The young woman who came before the king was shaped entirely by the system, and the system had its own guardian who knew the king better than any of them could ever know him. When each young woman went to the king, she spent the night with him. In the morning, she returned to the second harem, now under the care of Shashgaz, the eunuch in charge of the concubines. She did not return to the king unless he had been specifically pleased with her and called her by name. For most of the young women brought by the decree, this was the practical reality of all those 12 months of preparation, one night, and then the rest of their lives as an anonymous part of a collection that no public eye would ever see in full. Throughout all those 12 months, there was something Esther did not reveal. Mordecai walked every day before the court of the harem to learn of Esther and what was happening to her. Every day. The text repeats this insistently, as if to ensure that no one passed over this information without feeling the weight of it. A man at the king's gates, crossing the court of the harem day after day, without her being able to come out to meet him, without him being able to enter, to speak with her. The boundary between them had been created by the imperial decree, and neither of them had the means to dissolve it. But Mordecai kept the vigil of one who has chosen not to let go of what he loved, even when letting go would have been easier, even when the only presence possible was the silent circle he made on the outside. And Esther did not reveal her people or her family, just as Mordecai had instructed from the beginning. She was surrounded by women from all the provinces, from all the cultures, from all the ethnicities of the greatest empire on earth. None of them knew that the young woman who had immediately won Haggai's favor was the daughter of an exiled people who kept a body of laws and memories completely distinct from the world around them, who worshipped a single God who had no image and no temple in that city, who waited for the restoration of a land that had not been theirs for generations. Esther had learned since childhood to inhabit the border between two worlds. She had learned that identity is not only what you reveal, but also what you guard and when you keep it. And now that ability, cultivated in the everyday necessity of a life of exile, was being tested in the most extreme context she had ever faced. In the most watched palace in the ancient world, surrounded by people whose function was to observe everything, she guarded the most fundamental thing she carried. The text of Esther chapter 2, verse 15, introduces a detail that illuminates something about Esther's character in a way that goes beyond any explicit description. When her turn came to go to the king, she asked for nothing beyond what Haggai had designated. No additions, no personal preferences inserted into that moment which could determine the rest of her life. The text mentions this in silent contrast to what the other young women did. Each asked for what she wanted, using the available resources to compose the version of herself she thought would please the king. Esther stayed with what she had been given. And then the text adds something that transcends any strategy. She was pleasing to all who saw her. All, not just the king, not just Haggai. Everyone who looked at her arrived at the same conclusion. There was something in Esther that surpassed the usual categories of beauty or deliberate calculation. It was a quality the text records without fully naming, without analyzing with psychological or spiritual vocabulary. A quality that made people of radically different positions, with radically different interests, all arrive at the same conclusion when they were in her presence. The 10th month of the 7th year of Ahasuerus' reign, the month of Tevet. The text of Esther chapter 2 verse 16 records the date with the precision of an official document. Tevet corresponds approximately to December or January in the modern calendar. The 7th year of the reign means that Ahasuerus had been in power for 7 years. The deposing of Vashti had occurred in the 3rd year. This means that the process of gathering young women from across the empire, conducting them to Susa, subjecting them to the 12 months of preparation, and presenting them to the king, had consumed nearly 4 full years. 4 years since the decree went out. 4 years since an imperial order had transformed the lives of countless families in 127 provinces. Esther came before King Ahasuerus in the royal palace. The king loved Esther more than all the other women. She obtained grace and favor before him more than all the virgins. He placed the royal crown upon her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. The text records this with the same economy it had used to describe the fall of Vashti. No elaborate drama, no speech by the king, no ceremony described in detail. The fact happened. The Jewish orphan of Susa became queen of the greatest empire in the ancient world. But this is the end of the before. Everything narrated up to here is what came before. The exile of Mordecai's family decades before her birth. The death of her parents at a time the text records without a date. The upbringing under the care of a cousin who worked at the king's gates. The double life between the Hebrew identity preserved at home and the Persian face the world saw. The 12 months of preparation inside walls she had not chosen to cross. The silent vigil of Mordecai walking every day in a courtyard he could not enter. The favor immediately granted by Haggai without her having asked for anything. The restraint of adding nothing beyond what had been given, when the instinct for control would say to try everything. All of this happened before the crown. Every extraordinary trajectory has a before that no one photographs. Before the throne, there was a girl without parents in a city that was not hers, speaking a language that was not that of her deepest heritage, hiding an identity that one day would become her greatest strength. What happened to Esther before the palace was not an accident of history, not a series of casual events that by coincidence resulted in something grand. It was the formation of someone capable of bearing the weight of what was to come. Because what was to come was not simple. Being queen in an empire that was not hers, guarding a secret in a place where everything was under surveillance, facing a decree of extermination of her people, knowing that the only person in the world with the position to do something about it was you. All of this required an inner structure that is not built inside palaces. It is not learned in 12 months of cosmetics and preparations. It is not acquired with 7 designated maids and the best place in the harem. It is built in losses, in years of learning to exist between 2 worlds without fully belonging to either. In silences kept when revealing would have been easier. In 12 months of preparation, without anyone asking your opinion about what was happening to your own life. In waking up in the morning knowing that the only man who loved you as a daughter walked every day in a courtyard you could not cross, and standing up anyway. The crown was a moment. The before was an entire life. No one arrives at the decisive moment of their life without having been shaped by everything that came before it. And the things that form us are not the glories. They are the absences, the imposed boundaries, the identities guarded in silence until the right moment came to reveal them. Esther entered the throne as queen, but what made her capable of being queen was everything that happened before anyone knew her name.